Hi readers! We're going to compare and contrast two stories with the same character. We're going to read two stories that have one of my favorite characters, Curious George. The first book is called Curious George, the Dog Show. The second book we're going to read is called Curious George Builds a Home. Both of these books have the same main character, a monkey named George. Just because both of these books have the same character does not mean that they're going to be exactly the same. We're going to keep an eye out for what's different about their plot, setting, and theme. Let's start with Curious George, the Dog Show. George was going to a dog show. He had not been to a dog show before. He was very curious. The dog show was a surprise. The dogs were not doing tricks. They stood. They walked. They ran a little. That was all. George visited the dogs after the show. It was much more fun. George loved them so much that he wanted to take them home. So he did. The dog owners were busy getting ribbons. They did not see George leave with their dogs. At home, George wanted to count how many new friends he had. It was hard work. The dogs did not stay in one place. George had an idea. He put the big dogs in one room. He put the small dogs in another room. He put the hairy dogs in the bathroom. Then he counted 1, 2, 3 hairy dogs. The front door opened. It was George's best friend. The man was surprised to see dogs behind every door. There must be 20 of them, he said. The doorbell rang. 9 dog owners had come to get their dogs. George waved goodbye 9 times. What a great dog show it had been, right in his own home. Before we read our next story about Curious George, let's review what happened in this story. First, George goes to a dog show. He's very curious and excited. He visits the dogs and decides to take them home. He plays with the dogs at home, but then the dog owners take back their dogs. George had a fun time, but he doesn't get to keep the dogs. Let's see what this same character does in Curious George Builds a Home. Today, George was curious about a bird. He had seen a lot of pigeons, but none wearing an ankle tag. The pigeon had seen a lot of animals, but none drawing on a sketch pad. They spent the morning watching each other. "George, this is your best drawing yet," George's best friend, the man with the yellow hat, told him. "That tag the bird is wearing means that it is a homing pigeon. They're special birds that always return home." George looked hopeful. "Homing pigeons have a special home," the man added. "Our apartment is not a good home for a bird." George decided to start a very special new project. It took him a long time to build, but finally George revealed his masterpiece. It looked almost like a real tree. Baseball bats were the roots, and a coat rack was the trunk. A frayed brown rope was its bark. Toilet paper and rubber gloves hung off it like leaves. George had even added real soil. George's friend the pigeon hopped onto a branch. He settled in. But the man with the yellow hat had brought home a guest. It was the doorman who had been missing one of his pigeons. The pigeon happily flew over to the doorman. "This is my pigeon Compass," the doorman said. Poor George! He waved goodbye to Compass and the doorman. The man in the yellow hat showed him a real tree he had bought for George. But George shook his head and pointed to his own tree. He wanted the birds to visit that one. "I don't know if the birds will like that tree," the man said. But to George's delight, the birds did not agree with his friend. Not at all. So let's think about what just happened in this story. George is curious about the homing pigeon. Then he builds a special tree for the pigeon. But the doorman takes his pigeon back. And the birds still visit George's tree. Even though these stories had the same character George, now let's think about what was different with their setting, plot, and theme. We can use a Venn diagram to compare and contrast the stories. I'm going to think about what was different in the dog show than in George Builds a Home. The setting of the dog show was at George's house, kind of like in George Builds a Home, but it also mostly took place at the dog show. And in the dog show, the dog owners ended up taking the dogs back, and George didn't get to see them again. In George Builds a Home, the setting was also in George's house, but it mostly took place outside. The doorman ended up taking the bird back, but the bird still came to visit George. So in that story, he got to keep seeing the animals. Remember in the dog show, he didn't get to see those dogs anymore. What are some things that were similar that happened in both the dog show and in George Builds a Home? Well, in both stories, George accidentally gets in trouble, and in both stories, he makes new friends with animals. Can you think of one more thing that's the same in both stories? I was thinking that in both stories, George learns something new. In the dog show, he learns about a dog show for the first time, and in George Builds a Home, he learns how to build a special tree for pigeons. You could also say that in both stories, the setting is partly in George's home, and both stories also have animals. Did you think of anything else that was the same in both stories? Today we learned how to compare and contrast two stories with the same character. Great work, eSparkers!